There is a ship in the Galactic Museum of Conflict on Veth Prime that has no official designation. It has a hull number, 7 actuals scratched into the plating by hand, with what appears to be a piece of sharpened scrap metal. It has blast scoring so deep along its port quarter that the museum engineers spent 3 years debating whether the ship would survive being moved indoors. It has 17 different types of alloy in its hull plating, none of them matching, welded together in a pattern that the museum's senior metallurgist described in his official report as structurally incoherent and physically inexplicable. He also wrote, in a footnote at the bottom of that report, in a much smaller font, that he had tested the hull under simulated combat conditions. It had held, not just held, it had held better than ships built to spec, better than ships assembled in the Vathari yards with precision tolerances measured in fractions of a micron. Better than anything in the museum's collection, including 3 full-production warships from the Sarath Empire that were considered the gold standard of interstellar military engineering for 400 years. The footnote ends there. There is no explanation offered, just the data and the silence where the explanation should be. In the lobby of the museum, next to the entrance to the 7 actual exhibit, there is a placard. It reads, "This vessel was one of 41 ships assembled by the surviving population of the human colony World Reach Station over a period of 19 months, using salvage mining equipment, civilian transports, and materials stripped from the colony's own infrastructure. The fleet it belonged to had no official name. The humans who crewed it called it the scrapyard. The Tharkan Dominion, which sent 412 warships to destroy it, called it something else. That word has since been removed from the Tharkan language by formal edict of their High Council. No translation has been preserved. That is all the placard says. The rest of the story, the 19 months, the 41 ships, the 412 warships, and what happened when they met, that is a longer story. That is the story we are here for today. Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome to HFY Endurance Tales. This channel is built for one purpose: the stories of what human beings are actually capable of when there is nothing left but to find out. Not propaganda, not fantasy. The real version, built from real decisions made by real people in situations that should not have produced survivors. If that is what brought you here, hit subscribe right now. It costs you nothing, and it means we can keep making these. And if this story does what I think it's going to do to you, I want to hear about it in the comments. Drop a timestamp of the moment it hit you. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to Reach Station. 19 months before the battle, Reach Station was not a military installation. It had been founded 63 years earlier as a mining colony, a human settlement on the edge of the outer fringe, where the asteroid density made deep extraction operations viable, and the remoteness made oversight from the core worlds minimal. That last part had been the point. The founding families were the kind of people who had a complicated relationship with being told what to do. By the time of the Tharkan Dominion's formal notice of annexation, Reach Station had 17,000 permanent residents, 4 operational mining platforms, a shipyard that could handle medium-class freighter repairs, and a militia force of approximately 300 personnel equipped for riot suppression and piracy response. Not warships, patrol craft. The largest of them was a converted mining hauler with 2 gun emplacements bolted to the cargo bay doors, which the militia called the Morrigan, and which its crew called, with somewhat more accuracy, the Flying Coffin. The Tharkan notice arrived on a Tuesday. It was not a declaration of war. The Tharkan Dominion did not make declarations of war to species they had classified as Sub-Tier 3. They made administrative notifications. The notice informed Reach Station that the system had been assessed as falling within the Dominion's expansion zone under Provision 7 of the Outer Fringe Territorial Protocols, that all existing colony infrastructure would be absorbed into Dominion administration, and that the current occupants had 30 standard days to submit surrender documentation. After 30 days, a fleet would arrive to complete the transition. 13 pages, standard font, a formal reference number at the top. Signed not by a military commander, but by a mid-level Dominion administrator named Veth Sorath, whose office processed 14 such notifications per standard month and who would later tell the War Crimes Tribunal, with what appeared to be genuine bewilderment, that he had not expected the humans to do anything other than comply. Every species they had sent this notice to before had complied. The document was received at 8:47 station time by Commander Alara Voss, head of the Reach Station militia. She was 53 years old. She had spent 21 years in the Human Interstellar Defense Corps before a structural decision to reduce frontier postings had moved her outward, to the edge, to this colony of stubborn, resourceful people who had built something real in the middle of nowhere and were deeply uninterested in being told it belonged to someone else. She read the notice once, then she called a meeting. The meeting happened in the colony's largest space, the main hangar bay of Shipyard Platform 3, which smelled of cutting fluid and burnt metal, and the particular quality of air that exists in a place where things are constantly being made and remade. 3,000 people came. The rest watched on the colony's internal broadcast. Commander Voss stood at the center of the hangar bay with the notice projected on the wall behind her, large enough to read from the back. She said, "You've all seen this." The hangar bay was quiet. She said, "I'm not going to tell you what to decide. That's not my role here. My role is to tell you what the options actually are without dressing any of them up." She laid them out. Option 1, comply. Submit the documentation, become a Tharkin administrative zone. Their historical record on absorbed colonies was not encouraging. Restructured labor systems, resource extraction quotas, phased removal of local governance. But the alternative was the thing she was about to describe, and everyone needed to understand what that alternative actually cost. Option 2, evacuate. Reach Station had enough civilian transport capacity to move approximately 11,000 people. That left 6,000 behind. There was no clean version of that math. Option 3, fight. She said, "I want to be very specific about what fighting means. We have 300 trained militia. We have patrol craft. We have a shipyard that can do medium repairs, but has never built a warship. We have 19 months, because that is when the fleet they're sending will arrive. That's what our intelligence on Tharkin fleet mobilization timelines tells us. We have the ore from 4 mining platforms, civilian transports, the colony's infrastructure, and every person here who is willing to work." She paused. "I have spoken to every engineer, every miner, every fabricator, every pilot, and every weapons technician on this station. I've asked them one question. If we stripped this colony down to its bones and built the best fight we could, what would that look like?" She turned to the projection wall. The architectural renderings appeared, rough, angular, cobbled-together shapes that did not look like warships, because they had not been designed to look like warships. They had been designed to function like warships, which is a different thing and which sometimes produces a different result. 41 ships, she said. That is what our engineers tell me we can build in 19 months if we begin tomorrow, if every person on this station contributes. And if we accept that we are going to dismantle a significant portion of what we have built here to build something we have never built before. She let that sit. I am not telling you to fight. I am telling you that if you choose to fight, this is what it looks like. If you choose to fight, you are choosing to spend 19 months building something that has never been built, and then taking it against a fleet that has spent 400 years building theirs. A woman in the third row raised her hand. She was 61 years old. Her name was Dr. Myra Vasek, and she was the colony's chief structural engineer. She had spent 30 years building things in conditions that were not designed to support the building of things. She said, "Commander." "What are the Tharkin fleet numbers?" Voss said. "Between 300 and 500 warships. Our best estimate is 400. Vasek nodded. She said, "And our 41. Voss said, "Yes." Vasek was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll need to expand the fabrication crews on Platform 2. She sat back down. 3 hours later, 17,000 people voted. The count was 16,847 in favor of Option 3, 112 abstentions, 41 votes for compliance. Nobody voted for evacuation. That particular option had been removed not by decree, but by the quiet, collective decision of a community that had looked at the math and concluded that the 6,000 who would have been left behind were not a number they were willing to make. Commander Voss looked at the result. She said to no one in particular, "All right. Let's get to work." What the Tharkan Dominion's intelligence apparatus reported back to their High Council 3 months into the 19-month window was this: the human colony had not complied. The human colony had not evacuated. The human colony appeared to be engaged in a large-scale industrial project of uncertain purpose. Sensor readings indicated significant thermal output consistent with large-scale fabrication. Civilian transports were being moved into the shipyard platform docking bays and not coming out. The intelligence report recommended monitoring. The High Council agreed. They did not consider intervention. The Tharkan Dominion had been annexing outer fringe colonies for 200 years. The process was formulaic. Colonies did not fight back, not because they lacked the will, but because they invariably lacked the capacity. A planet of miners with patrol craft was not a military threat. The fleet would arrive in 16 months, and the question would resolve itself. The intelligence analyst who filed the report, a Tharkan officer named Drevasan, 14 years in the service. A reputation for careful work, added a personal annotation at the bottom of his assessment. It was not standard procedure. His supervisor would later remove it before the report reached the High Council, on the grounds that it was speculative and outside the scope of the assignment. The annotation read, "I have reviewed the historical record on human resistance activity. I note that every previous assessment of human capacity has been revised upward after contact. I recommend we increase monitoring frequency and request updated fleet deployment numbers. This annotation is speculative. I am filing it anyway." His supervisor removed it. The High Council never saw it. Drevasan retired from the intelligence service 4 years later. He never explained why. On Reach Station, the work did not look heroic from the inside. It looked like 18-hour shifts in fabrication bays, where the temperature fluctuated 20 degrees in either direction, and the air handlers were running at 140% capacity and still falling behind. It looked like Dr. Myra Vasek sleeping 4 hours a night on a cot in the Platform 2 machine shop, because the walk to her quarters and back was 40 minutes she couldn't spare. It looked like a 17-year-old apprentice welder named Tamaz Reyes making the same joint 40 times, until it held to the spec that Vasek's structural calculations demanded. And then doing it another 300 times, because that was how many joints were in the hull section his team had been assigned. It looked like Commander Voss sitting in the shipyard operations room at 200, reviewing power consumption reports, running the numbers on ore allocation, making the quiet decisions that kept 17,000 people building in the same direction, instead of 41 different ones. The ships that came out of Platform 3 were not elegant. The hull of 7 Actual, the ship that would end up in a museum, was assembled from the outer hull section of a decommissioned ore carrier. 3 interior bulkhead frames from mining Platform 1, which was stripped down to bare bones in month 4. 2 kilometers of structural conduit from the colony's secondary power grid. Impact plating taken from the drilling heads of the deep extraction rigs. And a central spine fabricated entirely from scratch by Vasek's team using a process she had invented during month 6, when the ore composition turned out to be 12% different from the projections, and she had to redesign the welding parameters from first principles over a weekend. The engines were jury-rigged. That is the only accurate word. Vasek herself used it. They were assemblies of mining drive cores, designed for pushing 100,000-ton ore blocks through the slow lanes of asteroid fields, rewired, retuned, and fed through thrust vectors that her team had calculated would produce the acceleration envelope they needed without tearing the hull apart. The calculations were correct. She ran them 11 times to be sure, using 3 different methods, and then she had 2 other engineers run them independently. The weapons systems were worse. Reach Station had no military-grade weaponry. What they had was mining equipment. High-intensity cutting lasers designed to slice through ore-bearing rock. Mass drivers used to launch ore containers to collection points. Electromagnetic pulse arrays used to survey subterranean mineral deposits. All of it was repurposed. None of it had been designed to be fired at another vessel in combat conditions. The weapons engineer who adapted the cutting lasers, a civilian named Dr. Orrin Park, who had a background in industrial optics and absolutely no military experience, described the process as follows, in the notes he kept throughout the project. We are doing something that has no manual. We are taking equipment designed to cut rock and asking it to cut ships. The physics is the same. The engineering is not. Every assumption I built my career on is wrong in some interesting new way every day. I am learning more in this shipyard than I learned in 20 years of formal study, and I am terrified that I am not learning it fast enough. He learned it fast enough. Month 11. The first ship came out of Platform 3. It did not look like a warship. It looked like what it was, a thing assembled from necessity, from salvage, from the refusal to accept the available options. Commander Voss stood on the observation deck and watched it move under its own power for the first time, slowly, carefully. The test pilot taking it through the minimum envelope, while Vasek and Park and 40 other engineers watched the sensor feeds and held their breath. It held, and it maneuvered, and the weapons arrays tracked correctly, and the thrust outputs were within 4% of projected, better than Vasek had told anyone to expect. She had given herself a 15% error margin and told no one, because she understood that engineering under pressure is the management of uncertainty. And the job of the engineer in that situation is to absorb as much of the uncertainty as possible before it reaches the people who are counting on her. Month 11, Ship 1. Month 14, Ships 2 through 8. Month 17, Ships 9 through 23. Month 19, Week 2, Ships 24 through 41. On the day the last ship launched, Commander Voss stood in the main hangar bay again. Different crowd, same smell of cutting fluid and burnt metal and the air of a place where things had been made. 17,000 people who had spent 19 months dismantling their home to build something that had never been built before. She said, 2 days. That was all she said. Everyone knew what it meant. I'm going to stop here for a moment, because I want you to sit with what that means. 17,000 people, 19 months. 41 ships built from the bones of their own colony, by engineers and miners and welders who had never built a warship. Built by a 17-year-old kid making the same joint 40 times until it held. Built by a structural engineer sleeping on a cot in a machine shop. Not because they were soldiers. Not because they had been trained for this. Because they looked at the math, 41 against 400, and decided that the math was not the point. That's what this channel is here for. Stories like this one. If you haven't subscribed yet right now, hit the button, turn on notifications, because we put out a new story every week and I'd hate for you to miss what's coming next. And keep that comment ready, because we are not done, and what happens next, I want to know if it hits you the way it hit me. The Tharkan fleet arrived on day 582. 412 warships. The 6th Expansion Fleet, under the command of Fleet Lord Karev Thar, a Tharkan officer of 30 years' experience, 36 prior annexations, and a record of efficient, clean operations that had earned him the rare distinction of a personal commendation from the High Council. He was not a cruel man. He was a precise man, and precision in his experience meant that the initial show of force resolved the situation without engagement, which was better for everyone. He expected the show of force to resolve the situation. He looked at the sensor readings when his fleet dropped out of transit. He looked again. His tactical officer said, "Fleet Lord, we are reading 41 contacts. Configuration unknown. They are not moving." Thar studied the readings. The contacts were arranged in a formation he did not recognize, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was entirely unlike any formation doctrine his 30 years of experience had prepared him to interpret. It looked improvised. It looked like the kind of formation you arrived at when you had no formation doctrine to draw on and had to invent one from first principles. He said, "Classification," his tactical officer said. "We cannot classify them. Hull composition is varied, multiple alloy signatures. Drive output is consistent with mining-class propulsion. Weapons signatures are not military standard. They appear to be adapted industrial systems." Thar was quiet for a moment. He had read the intelligence reports. He had seen the annotation that his counterpart in the intelligence service had tried to file, and that had been removed. He had not seen the annotation, But he had a 30-year instinct for the shape of a situation, and the shape of this situation was producing a sensation he did not entirely trust. He opened a channel to the human fleet. He said, in the formal Tharkan annexation proceeding register, "Human colony reach station. You are in violation of Provision 7 of the Outer Fringe Territorial Protocols. You have exceeded your compliance deadline by 552 days. In accordance with Dominion law, you are required to stand down immediately and submit to administrative processing. Your vessels will be boarded and your personnel will be transferred to Dominion holding facilities pending assessment." He paused. He said, "You have 10 minutes to comply." The channel was open. What came back was not a response. What came back was Commander Ilara Voss. Her voice was level. She had the quality of someone who had made all their decisions 19 months ago and had nothing left to decide. She said, "Fleet Lord Thar, I'm going to tell you something and I need you to hear it clearly." She paused. She said, "We know exactly what your fleet can do. We've spent 19 months studying it. We know your weapon ranges, your shield harmonics, your fleet formation doctrine, your tactical response protocols, and the specific thrust envelope of every class of ship you have in that formation. We know it because we had 19 months with nothing to do but learn everything there is to know about you." She paused again. She said, "You don't know anything about us." "Because we have never existed before." Thar said nothing. She said, "I'm not going to ask you to leave. I know you're not going to leave. I'm telling you this because after today, someone is going to have to explain what happened here, and I want there to be a record that you were told." The channel closed. Thar looked at his tactical officer. He said, "Battle formation. What happened in the next 4 hours has been analyzed, reconstructed, debated, and written about in 37 different languages by 6 different species. The Galactic Museum of Conflict has an entire wing dedicated to it. Military academies from the Sarath Empire to the Vathari Collective include it in their mandatory curriculum. What every analysis eventually arrives at is the same observation, stated in different ways. The Tharkan Dominion's 6th expansion fleet was defeated not by superior numbers, not by superior technology, and not by superior strategy in the conventional sense. It was defeated by a specific quality that has no military term and that every analyst has struggled to name. Dr. Myra Vasek would have called it structural honesty. She would have meant that the ships she built had no redundant weight, no systems installed for appearance, no plating added for symmetry. No component included because doctrine said it should be there. Every piece was there because it was necessary, and only as much of it as was necessary, and it was placed exactly where the physics demanded it be placed. The ships were honest in the way that things built under genuine constraint are honest. No waste, no decoration, no assumption that the builder had the luxury of getting it wrong. Fleet Lord Thar's ships were built to a doctrine, a 400-year-old doctrine, refined by tradition and tested against enemies who were also using doctrine. The doctrine was good. It was, genuinely, a very good doctrine. It had no answer for an enemy that had not read it. The first engagement lasted 11 minutes. The Tharkan formation advanced according to protocol, the standard 6th expansion approach, a broad front sweep designed to bracket and isolate targets. Against a conventional opponent, it would have worked exactly as it had 36 times before. The human fleet did not bracket. It did not hold formation. It did not respond to the advance the way the protocol anticipated. It went through. Straight through the center of the Tharkan formation, all 41 ships at full mining drive thrust, which was not a military thrust profile, and therefore not in any of the tactical officers' prediction models. The mass drivers that Dr. Park had adapted from ore launchers fired not in the tight targeting patterns of military rail systems, but in the wide dispersal patterns of industrial logistics, which had the effect of saturation coverage across a volume of space that conventional weapon systems didn't attempt to cover because it was outside conventional weapon doctrine. The cutting lasers fired in pulse sequences that no military laser system used, because no military laser system had been designed by an industrial optics engineer who had spent 19 months learning how to make a rock-cutting tool hit a moving target. In the first 11 minutes, the Tharkan 6th expansion fleet lost 19 ships. Thar reorganized. He was good. He adapted faster than his doctrine would normally have allowed. His 30 years of experience recognized that what he was seeing had no precedent, and that responding from precedent was going to kill more of his people. He pulled his fleet back. He reorganized into a tighter defensive formation and attempted to use numbers to bring the weight of 400 remaining ships to bear on 41. The human fleet did not engage the formation. It went around it. This is the part that took analysts the longest to understand. Commander Voss was not trying to destroy the Tharkan fleet. She had done the math. 41 ships against 400, even with the advantages she had built into her ships over 19 months, she could not destroy the Tharkan fleet. She had never believed she could destroy the Tharkan fleet. What she had believed, what she and Vasek and Park and every person on Reach Station had built toward for 19 months, was something different. She was trying to demonstrate a cost. Not a kill count, not a victory in the conventional sense, a cost. She was trying to make the Tharkan Dominion look at the math and conclude that annexing Reach Station, this one colony, these 17,000 people, this one corner of the outer fringe, was going to cost more than it was worth. The Tharkan Dominion's 36 previous annexations had cost them, on average, 0 ships per operation. The Tharkan Dominion's 37th was, by hour 3, on track to cost them somewhere between 60 and 90 warships. Thar was a precise man. He ran the calculation. At hour 3, mark 47 minutes, Fleet Lord Karev Thar opened a channel to Reach Station. He said, "Commander Voss," she said, "Fleet Lord." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you willing to accept?" She said, "Leave. And send a message to your High Council that this system is occupied and will cost more to annex than any system in the outer fringe is worth. And if they send another fleet, we will be ready for that one too, because we know how to build these ships now. And we have the ore for more." He said, "You would build more." She said, "We would build more." He was quiet again. He said, "You understand that I cannot guarantee what my High Council decides." She said, "I understand that you're going to tell them the truth about what happened here. And the truth is going to be sufficient." Thar said, "You lost 11 ships." She said, "Yes." He said, "You knew you would lose ships." She said, "We knew we might lose everything. We decided the cost was acceptable." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because there are 17,000 people on Reach Station who built something worth defending. And because nobody who lives here was willing to be the one who decided it wasn't." The channel was silent for a long time. Fleet Lord Karev Thar gave the order to withdraw. 412 warships, 349 remaining, turned and left the Reach Station system. They did not return. The official Tharkan High Council report on the Reach Station engagement, classified for 60 years, and then released as part of a broader treaty negotiation, contains one passage that has since been quoted more than any other in the entire history of Tharkan military documentation. It was written by Fleet Lord Thar. It appears in the section of the report labeled Tactical Assessment. He wrote, "We encountered a fleet assembled from salvage, mining equipment, and civilian infrastructure. We had every technological, numerical, and doctrinal advantage available to Dominion forces. We sustained losses that, if replicated across a standard annexation campaign, would render expansion operations economically unviable within 11 years. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 7 minutes. In those 4 hours and 7 minutes, I observed the following: not one human vessel attempted retreat. Not one channel communication indicated doubt or request for terms. The fleet maneuvered and fought as a single organism with complete structural coherence for the full duration of the engagement, including during the period when our tactical models projected that morale degradation would begin to affect coordination. It did not. I have reviewed 36 prior engagements in my career. I do not have a framework for what I observed here. I am filing this report as accurately as I am able to and acknowledging that accuracy may be insufficient." The report was read by the High Council. The annexation program for the outer fringe was suspended within 3 months. Officially, the suspension was due to resource reallocation priorities. Unofficially, in the private communications of 3 High Council members that were also eventually released, the reason was simpler. They had looked at what 41 ships had cost them. They had done the math on what 41 more would cost them. Then they had considered the question of how many more fleets there might be, not from Reach Station specifically, but from every colony in the outer fringe that had read the same reports they had, and drawn the same conclusions, and they had decided quietly, without announcement, to find a different approach to expansion. The Tharkan Dominion signed the Outer Fringe Non-Annexation Accords 14 months later. It was the first treaty of its kind in Tharkan history. It was negotiated by a delegation of 3. The lead negotiator was a woman named Commander Alara Voss, who arrived at the negotiations in the same militia uniform she had worn for 21 years, with the Reach Station colony seal on the left breast pocket. She did not bring a military escort. She brought Dr. Myra Vasek and Dr. Oren Park. The Tharkan delegation, numbering 11, asked about this. Voss said, "They're the ones who built the ships. If you want to understand what you're agreeing to, you should talk to them." On Reach Station, the 11 ships that had been lost in the battle were never removed from the list. Vasek insisted on this. She had built 41 ships. She knew every hull number, every structural compromise, every decision made under pressure, and why it had been made. She had built 11 of those ships with the understanding, which she did not say aloud but which was present in every calculation she ran, that some of them would not come home. She did not speak at the memorial service. She had been asked to, and she had declined. What she did instead was go back to Platform 2, where she had slept on a cot for 19 months, and she sat at her workbench, and she opened the project file she had been keeping since day 1. It was 4,216 pages long. It was the complete engineering record of everything she had learned building ships that had never been built before, in conditions that had never existed before, with materials that had never been intended for this purpose. She spent the next 8 months writing it into a form that other engineers could use. She called it the Reach methodology. Not because she was particularly attached to the name, she wasn't, but because it was accurate. It was the methodology that had come from Reach Station, from the specific set of constraints and necessities that 19 months of building in the dark had produced. And it belonged to those circumstances and should be named for them. The Reach methodology was distributed freely to every human colony in the outer fringe within 2 years. Within 10 years, it was in use in shipyards across 6 species territories, not to build warships mostly, but because the principles that made 7 actuals hull hold under combat stress turned out to make freighters more durable and mining platforms more structurally resilient, and habitation modules significantly less prone to pressure failure. The 17 different alloys in 7 actuals hull, welded together in a pattern that the museum metallurgist had called structurally incoherent, turned out to be structurally incoherent only if you assumed a single uniform alloy composition throughout. If you understood what Vasek had understood, that different sections of a hull face different stress profiles, and that matching the alloy to the stress rather than to the aesthetic was the correct approach, the pattern was not incoherent at all. It was the most efficient hull design anyone had ever produced. The museum metallurgist wrote a second report. He did not put the most important part in a footnote this time. The colony of Reach Station still exists. It is larger now, 26,000 permanent residents, new mining platforms. A shipyard that can build from scratch, not repair, build. Because after the engagement, there was no shortage of people who wanted to learn how to do what Vasek and Park and Voss had done. In the main square of the colony's central hub, there is a monument. It is not what you might expect. It is not a warship rendered in stone. It is not a set of names carved into a wall. It is a single piece of hull plating from one of the 11 ships that did not come home, mounted on a frame of the same mismatched alloys that 7 actuals hull was made from. On the plating, someone welded 3 words, not painted, not engraved, welded in the same technique Tamaz Reyes learned to make 40 times over until it held. 3 words, we built something. Commander Alara Voss retired from service 2 years after the accords were signed. She moved into a smaller quarter on Reach Station. She had always lived simply, and after 19 months of shipyard operations, she had lost the habit of wanting more space than she needed. She spent her retirement doing 2 things. The first was teaching, not formally, but the colony's young people knew where to find her. and they knew that if you showed up at her door with a real question, she would give you a real answer. She did not talk much about the engagement. When she did talk about it, she talked about the months before, the planning, the decisions, the specific problem-solving that went into each ship. The way a community of 17,000 people had organized itself around a shared, impossible task. She talked about that the way someone talks about the best work they ever did, because it was. The second thing was letters. She wrote to Drevasan, the Tharkan intelligence officer who had tried to file the annotation that his supervisor removed. She had read the classified report after the accords were signed. She had found his name in the footnotes. She wrote to him because she thought he deserved to know that his instinct had been correct. He wrote back. They corresponded for 11 years. He visited Reach Station once in the 9th year. He stood in the main square and looked at the hull plating monument for a long time. He said, "I wrote that annotation because the data told me something that the doctrine didn't have room for. And my supervisor told me I was being speculative." She said, "You were being speculative." He said, "I was right." She said, "You were both." He thought about that. He said, "In my language, there is a word for an assessment that cannot be proven at the time it is made, but that turns out to be correct. We use it as an insult. As a way of saying the person was lucky, not right." She said, "And in mine, we'd probably call that the same thing." He said, "Does that bother you? That they would call what you did lucky?" She looked at the monument, at the 3 welded words. She said, "We spent 19 months building 41 ships out of mining equipment and stubbornness. We went up against 400 warships built by a 400-year-old empire. We lost 11 ships and brought home 30. And what we built changed the outer fringe for every colony that came after us." She paused. "Call it lucky if you want." "I'll call it what it is." He said, "What is it?" She said, "It's what happens when 17,000 people decide that the math is not the point." That's the story of Reach Station. Of 41 ships built from nothing. Of Commander Alara Voss and Dr. Myra Vasek and Dr. Oren Park and a 17-year-old welder named Tamaz Reyes, who made the same joint 40 times until it held. Of a fleet lord who told the truth in his report, when the truth was not what his high council wanted to hear. Of a colony that looked at 400 warships and decided that the math was not the point. That's what this channel is, not the loudest stories. The ones built from the bones of real decisions, made by real people, in situations that should not have produced survivors, and did. If this one got you, and I think it did, leave a comment. Tell me which moment landed. Was it the vote, the ships coming out of Platform 3 one by one? The channel open and Voss telling Thar, "You don't know anything about us because we have never existed before. Tell me." I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell. New story every week. And the next one is about a human diplomat who was sent to a negotiation with no authority, no backing, and instructions to observe only. She observed for about 40 minutes. After that, she started talking. "I'm your narrator. This has been HFY Endurance Tales. Thank you for being the kind of person who stays all the way to the end. That's not nothing. That never is. Take care of yourselves. We'll talk soon."